Of having his support, you know what I'm saying? His support is like very, very different from what I've had in the past, and how he speaks to me and stuff is very different. There you go.
What happens when the story flips and the exposure doesn't hit the person everyone expected? Because this time, the shock didn't come from denial, it came from panic. According to what's now circulating, the moment Claressa Shields' side of the story began surfacing publicly, something changed behind the scenes. The tone shifted, the silence cracked, and suddenly the people who had remained calm, distant, and controlled were no longer moving the same way. This wasn't damage control, this looked like fear of what might come next. This story isn't about one person being exposed. It's about what happens when exposure threatens to pull back a much larger curtain. Because when someone reacts with rage instead of clarity, it raises a different kind of question. Not is this true, but what are they afraid will be uncovered? According to the narrative now unfolding, Claressa Shields didn't need to speak loudly. She didn't need to accuse anyone directly. The exposure didn't come from screaming. It came from patterns becoming visible, from timelines making sense, from silence no longer working the way it used to. And once that happened, the response wasn't calm. It was emotional, defensive, uncontrolled. That's where panic sets in. Because panic doesn't come from lies alone. Panic comes when lies are no longer enough, when control over the narrative starts slipping, when someone realizes that the version of events they depended on might not survive public scrutiny. What makes this moment dangerous isn't anger itself, it's who the anger is aimed at. When rage turns outward instead of inward, it signals desperation. It signals that the exposure isn't just embarrassing, it's threatening. And tonight, we're breaking down why this reaction matters more than any statement ever could. Because when panic replaces strategy, the truth is usually closer than anyone wants to admit. According to the narrative now being discussed, the reaction that followed Claressa Shields' exposure is what truly shifted the tone of this entire situation. Up until that point, everything had been managed with distance and restraint. Silence was maintained. Engagement was limited. The strategy appeared to be patience. But once Claressa's side of the story began circulating in a way that couldn't be dismissed or quietly ignored, the emotional temperature reportedly changed fast. This is where Remy allegedly stopped moving with calculation and started moving with reaction. And reactions, especially public ones, tend to reveal more than words ever could. What stood out to many observers was not just frustration, but intensity. According to accounts, the response didn't focus on clarifying facts or addressing details. Instead, it centered on anger. And anger, in moments like this, is rarely about reputation alone. It's about fear of losing control over the narrative. When someone believes the story is no longer fully in their hands, the instinct is not always to explain. Sometimes the instinct is to intimidate, deflect, or overwhelm the moment so attention shifts away from the substance of what's being exposed. Claressa Shields' role in this shift is important. She did not come forward with a loud campaign or dramatic accusations. According to the narrative, her exposure came through consistency, through alignment of timelines, through the absence of contradiction. That kind of exposure is harder to attack because it doesn't rely on emotion. It relies on coherence. And when coherence begins to spread publicly, it creates pressure behind the scenes. Pressure that builds quickly when there are unresolved questions tied to money, credibility, and trust. This is where panic reportedly began to set in. Panic doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like rage. It looks like overreaction. It looks like someone responding to implication instead of fact, because implication is often more dangerous. Facts can be denied. Implications force people to connect dots on their own. According to the narrative, this is the moment where the situation stopped being manageable through silence alone. Because once the public starts sensing that something doesn't add up, emotional reactions only amplify suspicion rather than silence it. At this stage, the exposure was no longer just about Claressa Shields as an individual. It became about what her story suggested, about systems, access, and behavior patterns. And when someone reacts strongly before being formally accused, it raises a question that no statement can fully answer. Not did something happen, but why does this reaction feel so urgent? That question is what shifts power away from rage and toward scrutiny. And once scrutiny takes hold, control becomes much harder to regain. According to the narrative developing around this situation, the shift from restraint to rage did not happen randomly. It happened at the exact moment when silence stopped working. For a long time, the absence of direct statements had served a purpose. It allowed speculation to burn itself out. It allowed attention to drift. It relied on the assumption that without constant updates, the public would eventually move on. But that strategy only works when the underlying story remains fragmented. Once the fragments begin to align, silence loses its power. And that is when anger often takes its place. What observers reportedly noticed was that the response was not proportionate to what had been publicly said. There were no detailed accusations, no legal filings, no dramatic interviews from Claressa Shields that demanded an explosive rebuttal. Yet the reaction carried the weight of someone who felt cornered rather than misunderstood. This distinction matters. Anger that rises in response to exposure is different from anger that rises in response to lies. One seeks correction. The other seeks control. And according to the narrative, this reaction appeared focused on stopping momentum rather than clearing confusion. The psychology behind this is simple but uncomfortable. When a person believes they still control the narrative, they remain calm. When they sense that control's slipping, emotions surface. Panic does not always show itself as fear. Often it manifests as aggression, deflection, or exaggerated confidence. According to the narrative, this is exactly what happened here. The tone became sharper. The responses became more personal. The energy shifted from distance to confrontation. And confrontation, especially when it arrives early, signals that something deeper is at stake. What made this moment even more telling was what was missing. There were no clear explanations. No step-by-step breakdowns. No effort to transparently resolve the questions being raised. Instead, the focus reportedly moved toward attacking credibility and reframing motives. That is a common move when facts are inconvenient. If the story itself cannot be dismantled, attention is redirected toward the person telling it. But that approach only works when the audience doubts the storyteller. In this case, Claressa's consistency made that difficult. As the exposure gained traction, the anger began to look less like confidence and more like urgency. And urgency is rarely about reputation alone. It is about what might be uncovered next. Because when financial questions remain unanswered and emotions escalate, people begin to assume that there is more beneath the surface. According to the narrative, this is when panic fully set in. Not because of what had already been exposed, but because of what exposure could lead to if it continued unchecked. This phase marked a turning point. No longer was the situation being managed quietly. It was reacting loudly. And loud reactions, especially when clarity is absent, tend to accelerate scrutiny rather than stop it. Once that happens, the narrative no longer belongs to the person reacting. It belongs to the audience watching the reaction and asking themselves a single, unavoidable question. Why does this feel like someone trying to regain control instead of someone telling the truth? According to the narrative taking shape, this was the point where fear began to outweigh calculation. Up until now, the situation had been managed through distance, selective silence, and the assumption that attention would eventually fade. But once Claressa Shields' position started gaining credibility in the public eye, the risk profile changed. Exposure stopped being hypothetical and started feeling inevitable. And when that happens, people don't react to what's been said, they react to what might be said next. That distinction is critical because fear is not driven by the past. It is driven by the future. What made this phase especially volatile was that Claressa Shields did not need to over-explain herself. Her exposure did not rely on emotional appeals or dramatic storytelling. It relied on consistency, on timelines that made sense, on questions that remained unanswered. According to the narrative, this kind of exposure is far more dangerous than accusation because it invites the public to reach conclusions on their own. When people connect dots independently, control over the narrative collapses quickly. And once that collapse begins, panic becomes visible in behavior, not statements. This is where reactions allegedly became sharper and less measured. The tone reportedly shifted from guarded to defensive, from distant to confrontational. And confrontation in moments like this rarely signals confidence, it signals urgency. According to observers, the anger didn't seem aimed at correcting falsehoods. It seemed aimed at stopping momentum, at shutting down conversation, at reasserting dominance over a narrative that was no longer fully contained. That kind of reaction suggests fear of escalation, not relief that the truth is known. The presence of Claressa Shields in this story is what intensifies that fear. She is not a figure easily dismissed as unstable or opportunistic. Her reputation for discipline, focus, and consistency works against any attempt to undermine her credibility. When someone like her speaks carefully and selectively, it carries weight. According to the narrative, that weight is what shifted the power dynamic. Suddenly, silence no longer protected those being questioned. It only amplified the perception that there was something to hide. At the same time, the emotional reaction attributed to Remy Ma reportedly raised additional concerns. Rage, especially when it appears before clear accusations, invites scrutiny rather than deflects it. People begin asking why the response feels disproportionate, why the emotion seems personal rather than factual, why clarity is replaced by intensity. Those questions don't require answers to be damaging. They live on their own, growing louder with every reaction that avoids transparency. According to the narrative, this was the moment when panic fully replaced strategy. Not because everything had been exposed, but because the exposure was no longer controllable. Once that line is crossed, every move becomes reactive. And reactive behavior, no matter how forceful, tends to reveal the very vulnerability it is trying to conceal. This is where the story stopped being about one reaction and became about what that reaction might be protecting, and why time suddenly felt like an enemy instead of an ally. According to the narrative, this was the phase where panic stopped being contained and started creating problems of its own. When fear replaces strategy, decisions become rushed, and rushed decisions leave trails. What once looked like confidence now appeared brittle. What once felt controlled now felt reactive. And the more emotional the responses became, the harder it was for observers to ignore the imbalance between what was being said and what was being avoided. In situations like this, panic doesn't just show up in anger, it shows up in inconsistency, in overcorrection, in the sudden need to speak where silence once felt safe. What reportedly stood out during this stage was how quickly the tone escalated without a corresponding increase in clarity. There were strong emotions, sharp words, and visible frustration, but still no clean explanations addressing the core concerns. That gap matters, because when emotions rise and information doesn't, people naturally assume the information is the problem. According to the narrative, every emotional reaction that avoided specifics only made the underlying questions louder. Instead of shutting the story down, the reactions fed it. Instead of discouraging scrutiny, they invited it. This is where panic becomes self-defeating. The goal of reacting emotionally is often to intimidate, distract, or exhaust the conversation. But when the audience senses fear behind the anger, the tactic backfires. Observers stop listening to what's being said and start analyzing why it's being said that way. According to the narrative, this is exactly what happened. The focus shifted from Claressa Shields' exposure to the reactions it triggered. And once reactions become the story, control is effectively lost. Another critical detail during this phase is timing. Panic tends to surface when someone realizes they are no longer moving ahead of the narrative, but behind it. According to the narrative, this realization came when speculation did not die down as expected. Instead, it stabilized. People stopped arguing over rumors and started asking structural questions. Questions about money, about access, about who benefited and who was left exposed. Those are not questions that anger can answer. And the more forcefully anger tried to silence them, the more permanent they became. At this point, the damage was no longer about reputation alone. It was about credibility. Emotional reactions began to undermine the very authority they were meant to defend. According to the narrative, the fear was no longer just about exposure. It was about loss of control over perception. Once people stop believing reactions and start watching behavior, the narrative takes on a life of its own. And behavior, unlike statements, cannot be edited or taken back. This phase marks the moment where panic becomes visible not as fear but as error. Errors in tone, errors in timing, errors in judgment. And in public situations involving money, trust, and credibility, those errors compound quickly. According to the narrative, this is where the situation moved beyond damage control. Because panic had already done what exposure alone could not, it convinced people that something was truly at stake, and that whatever it was worth hiding. According to the narrative, this was the moment where the situation crossed a line that could not be undone. Panic no longer looked like emotion. It looked like exposure. Because when reactions start creating more questions than answers, the focus shifts permanently. The conversation is no longer about whether allegations are true. It becomes about why the response feels so urgent, so defensive, and so misaligned with what has actually been said publicly. And once that shift happens, perception hardens. At this stage, the most damaging factor was not what Claressa Shields had revealed, but what the reactions revealed unintentionally. Panic has a way of stripping away polish. It removes patience. It removes calculation. It pushes people to act before thinking, to speak before planning, and to respond to implication as if it were confirmation. According to the narrative, this is where mistakes multiplied. Not legal mistakes, but narrative ones. Each emotional response added weight to the idea that something serious was being protected, not clarified. What made this phase irreversible was the loss of credibility. Once reactions feel disproportionate, the audience stops giving the benefit of the doubt. Silence can be strategic, but rage invites scrutiny. And scrutiny, once activated, does not require new information to grow. It feeds on inconsistency. It feeds on avoidance. It feeds on fear. According to the narrative, this is when public attention stopped drifting and started settling. People weren't waiting for statements anymore. They were watching behavior. This is the quiet danger of panic. It accelerates the very outcome it is trying to prevent. Instead of discouraging deeper investigation, it signals that investigation is necessary. Instead of closing the story, it locks it into place. According to the narrative, this is where the situation now stands, not exploded, not resolved, but frozen in a moment where every move is being measured, every reaction analyzed, and every silence interpreted. At this point, the damage is no longer about exposure. It's about control being lost. Because once panic shows itself, the story no longer belongs to the people reacting. It belongs to everyone watching and asking the same question. If there's nothing to hide, why does this feel like fear? At this point, the story is no longer about reactions, rage, or even exposure. It's about what panic reveals when silence stops working. Because panic doesn't appear unless something valuable feels threatened. And in situations like this, what's being protected is rarely just reputation. It's leverage, it's control. It's the ability to shape how the story ends instead of being forced to respond to it. What makes this moment critical is that nothing has actually been denied in a way that closes the door. There have been emotions, reactions, and distancing, but not clarity. And clarity is the one thing that ends speculation. When clarity doesn't come, people stop waiting for statements and start drawing conclusions from behavior. Who explains voluntarily, who deflects, who reacts emotionally, who stays silent, those patterns speak louder than any interview ever could. This is why stories like this don't disappear. They pause, they sit, they wait. And they resurface when pressure builds again. Because when panic enters the picture, it tells the audience that the exposure touched something real, something unresolved, something that can't simply be shouted away. Now the question shifts to you. Do you believe this reaction was justified, or does it look like fear of what might come next? Do you think rage protects the truth or exposes insecurity? And when someone responds emotionally instead of transparently, what does that say about what they're trying to protect? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but keep it real. Not hate, not sides. Analysis. If this breakdown made you look at the situation differently, like the video so others actually see it. Share it if you think panic reactions deserve more scrutiny than headlines give them. And subscribe if you want more long-form breakdowns that focus on behavior, power, and what people reveal when control starts slipping. Because the loudest part of this story isn't what was said, it's what still hasn't been explained.